Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be continuing our election profile series by taking a look at the New York governor's race. Now, New York is not really a state I talk about much on this channel because, quite frankly, it's not exactly a competitive state. It's been won by every Democratic nominee for president since 1988 consistently, and even on the state level, Democrats have total dominance in every chamber and every statewide office in state government. But some recent polls have raised some eyebrows in this election that indicate that this race might be actually closer than many people expect. So of course we're going to take a look at those polls as well as New York's electoral history to kind of determine whether or not it's realistic for the Republicans to be able to flip this seat in November. So we're going to take a look at all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this governor's race pitches Kathy Hochul, the incumbent Democratic governor, against current Republican Representative Lee Zeldin. Now, Kathy Hochul assumed the governorship in August of last year upon former Governor Andrew Cuomo's resignation due to sexual scandal, as well as a number of other things that ultimately brought down his administration and cratered his approval ratings. Now, if Cuomo was running on the ballot instead of Kathy Hochul, I think we'd be talking about a very competitive race because even in polls between Cuomo and Zeldin and other potential Republican candidates, they were all within the margin of error. Now, ultimately, I think that might have changed. Cuomo is a super powerful figure in New York politics, and even though he was taken down last year, I think he still has a vast network of Democrats and donors that would ultimately back him if he did run for re-election. And I think a lot of the problems that he faced would somehow be swept under the rug by many of the people in New York that prop up his campaign. But ultimately, I think it would be a very competitive race. Now, if we take a look at the polls between Hochul and Zeldin, currently Hochul has, depending on which average you look at, anywhere from a 14-point to a 16-point lead in the polling aggregate. That's, of course, according to Real Clear Politics and FiveThirtyEight. If we take a look at some of the recent polls, though, a poll from Coefficient and a poll from Trafalgar in particular have this race really close, especially for a race in New York. The Trafalgar poll has Kathy Hochul only up by 5 points, and the Coefficient poll has Kathy Hochul up only by 6. Now, mind you, most of these other polls don't have the race nearly that close, and that's one of the reasons why the average is so slanted. And of course, some of them, McLaughlin and Associates, for instance, are Republican-leaning pollsters as well as Trafalgar, and Coefficient doesn't exactly have a real strong track record in polling. But ultimately, the fact that Zeldin is getting 39, 43, 43, 31, 40%, 35, 39, those numbers are relatively realistic. Obviously, I don't think Zeldin's going to get as low as 31%, but anywhere from around 37 to the low 40s, I think is very realistic for this type of environment. Lee Zeldin is running, in my opinion, a very good campaign for the state of New York because he's mainly focusing on the economy and another key issue in the state, and of course that's crime. And that's a huge issue, especially in the New York City metro area. I mean, if we take a look at the 2020 election, on face value, New York is not a competitive state. This is a state that Joe Biden won by 23 percentage points, and in fact, Joe Biden massively outperformed Trump in upstate New York, which is historically the more conservative part of the state. But if we take a look at the areas that trended more Republican from 2016 to 2020, it was the New York City metro area, and the Bronx in particular trended 12 points more Republican than where it was in 2016, and that's one of the reasons why I think Zeldin is campaigning as much as he is in New York City, because from a Republican nominee, we really haven't seen that in recent years. I mean, you have to go back to 2002 to the last time when a Republican was actually elected to statewide office in New York, and of course that was moderate Republican Governor Pataki being reelected to a third term. And ultimately, that map looks a lot different than the current political map in the state of New York. George Pataki had the benefit of being a very popular governor as well as a very moderate governor. Also, he had an independent candidate taking up about 14% of the vote. Presumably, a sizable chunk of that vote would have went to the Democrat. You would never see a map like this in New York ever again, at least not for the foreseeable future. You have counties like Westchester going for the Republicans. You have Queens County almost going for the Republicans. So you have these high population counties, which in today's political environment are safe blue, almost going Republican. Even if Lee Zeldin has a very good night in November, it would be hard to imagine him getting any of these counties particularly close. Now, in New York City in particular, places like Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, I think the crime message would resonate very strongly. And one of the first TV ads that Zeldin has released statewide, which actually has millions of dollars behind it, is an ad specifically focusing on the issue of crime. And I think it's one of Kathy Hochul's weak points in this race. Now, obviously, Kathy Hochul has a number of strengths. For one, she's actually from upstate, so some of the areas, presumably, that would be stronger for Zeldin and the Republicans. She could stop the bleeding in enough upstate counties to make her victory extremely comfortable come November, because ultimately her being from upstate is a factor. Now, in 2018, despite it being a blue wave year around the country, Mark Molinaro massively overperformed in upstate New York compared to previous Republican nominees. And the main reason for that was Andrew Cuomo was very unpopular upstate, even among some Democratic voters. I mean, if we take a look at some of the margins in, the area around Syracuse, Onondaga County, Rochester, Erie County, home to Buffalo, these are all strongly Democratic counties on the presidential level. But if we take a look at their margins in the governor's race, in this instance, Andrew Cuomo is only winning by 6 points in Onondaga County. This is a county that just 2 years later, Joe Biden would win by 20 points. So massive overperformances in basically every upstate county. But the area that really made it so that Mark Molinaro would not only lose, but lose by a larger margin than Donald Trump did just 2 years earlier, of course, were the margins for Andrew Cuomo downstate. Andrew Cuomo was incredibly strong downstate. He won Suffolk County, for instance, by about 5 points. This is a strongly suburban, heavily populated county that Donald Trump won by about 7 points 2 years earlier. He ended up winning it by 5. Nassau County, he won by an incredibly safe margin. And in the boroughs of New York as well, Staten Island going blue, which is something, a lot of people don't think about when they think of Staten Island. Brooklyn, Queens, etc. All of these areas, Cuomo massively overperformed. Mark Molinaro underperformed. Now, if we go back to 2016, Donald Trump also did pretty well upstate. Of course, he didn't do as well as Mark Molinaro, but he was able to also improve his margins downstate, which is one of the reasons why he got 36% of the vote as opposed to around 35.1 or whatever margin Mitt Romney got, because he did much worse in upstate New York. And if we look at the trends from 2012 to 2016, Donald Trump overperformed basically everywhere except a couple of areas: Westchester County, Tompkins County. Westchester is a very liberal suburban county. Tompkins is a liberal university county, so on and so forth. So, of course, you had all of the state of New York essentially trend red from 2012 to 2016. In 2020, though, there was a pretty significant snapback. Now, because of the trends that we saw in New York City, Donald Trump improved his overall raw vote percentage, but he didn't improve his margin. In fact, he lost by more. Now, for somebody like Lee Zeldin, the challenge is being able to balance both of these coalitions, being able to do better downstate and do better upstate. Now, something Kathy Hochul has going for her, obviously, is that upstate New York isn't exactly that red. I mean, when you compare it to other states in the area, Pennsylvania, for instance, even Ohio, other Rust Belt sort of states, and, upstate New York is sort of considered Rust Belt. A lot of these counties are light red. These are not solid red counties like neighboring Pennsylvania, where you have some counties where the Republican is winning by over 50 percentage points. A lot of these upstate counties, Republicans are winning by single digits or in some cases low double digits. I mean, there's only a select few where the Republicans are winning significant margins, and most of those are concentrated in Western New York, but they don't really have a large population. That's one of the reasons why Republicans have struggled thus far to really break through in the state of New York, because their performances in the urban and suburban counties aren't sufficient to even make it a close race. And if Zeldin wants any chance at winning the governorship, he needs to have dictatorial margins in upstate New York. He has to do well downstate. He has to win Suffolk County by like 15, 20 points. He'd have to win Nassau County by like 15. That's an extremely, extremely tall order, and something that at this point I don't think is very realistic at all. Now, even despite the fact that I think Lee Zeldin is running a great campaign, and him being from downstate, specifically Suffolk County, is going to help him electorally sort of narrow up the margins between himself and Kathy Hochul, Kathy Hochul still has the benefit, of course, of being a Democrat in a very Democratic state. And she's also an incumbent governor. She was never elected as governor. She assumed the position, again, after Andrew Cuomo resigned back in the summer of 2021. And she really hasn't had really high approval ratings. If we take a look at this Siena College poll, she's underwater by about 11 points. And this is the most recent poll that I could find on Kathy Hochul's approval ratings. And, you know, there have been some polls that have been contradictory. There's some where she's well above water, and there's other where she's below water. So I think the truth lies somewhere in between. She's probably a bit underwater. I think Biden, in fact, is slightly above water in the state of New York now. I'm not exactly sure. He might actually be a little bit below water. But either way, I don't think the national environment is going to have as big of an impact on this governor's race as it will on other races around the country. But I think Lee Zeldin also has some major weaknesses. Of course, the number one being his close ties to Donald Trump while he was in Congress. And of course, him voting against certifying the election, which of course is on TV ads here in New York right now, which really doesn't bode well with a lot of moderate independent voters. And even some Democrats that, you know, might lean towards Zeldin on issues like crime, bail reform, and even the economy. Ultimately, those kind of keep those voters from jumping ship and going to Lee Zeldin. The fact that Lee Zeldin is a conservative Republican running in a very liberal state, I think is really something that makes him ultimately unviable. Now, I think Lee Zeldin will do a lot better than previous Republicans over the past decades. I think he'll have the best Republican performance for governor since George Pataki. But I really think he does have a ceiling of around 43%. And of course, again, since there's two candidates on the ballot, only two candidates on the ballot, I think that is something that benefits him. I think, you know, some of those libertarian and independent voters that would have otherwise voted third party would probably vote for Zeldin over Kathy Hochul, but I think still he does have a ceiling in the state of around 43%. And that's where I think realistically he'll probably land. I don't think it's realistic at this point that somebody like Zeldin wins. I think he'll improve basically all over the state. He'll do better in the New York City metro area. He'll do better on Long Island than Trump did back in 2020. Might even do better than he did in 2016 in Suffolk County, which is his home county. But I think he could potentially win Nassau County, which I think is a tall order in itself. It's a county that voted for Joe Biden by about over 9 percentage points. But I think it's a county that Lee Zeldin could narrowly win, especially being from Long Island and Kathy Hochul not exactly being very popular. But of course, she's still going to hold on because of the extremely strong showing she's going to have in the New York City area, as well as the upstate cities. I mean, New York's upstate cities never used to be as blue as they are today. And of course, the trends happening in urban areas in New York are happening all over the country. They're getting bluer. These are the areas where New York's population is really concentrated. Even in counties that have a tradition of voting for more moderate Republicans, like Onondaga, for instance, John Katko, the current representative there, who's not running for re-election, I think in a statewide race will still end up going for the Democrat, especially since Lee Zeldin is more of a conservative Republican, and up until recently, a very Trump Republican. And he's even met with Trump on a number of occasions at Mar-a-Lago to try and fundraise for this race, and I think Trump has given him a number of shout-outs. So ultimately, I think Zeldin will do better than Republicans have in the state of New York in decades, but I still think he ends up losing by a safe Democratic margin at the end of the day. I think he loses by about 13, 14 percentage points when it's all said and done. So I think this race is going to be somewhat interesting. I think the down-ballot coattails could be very beneficial to Republicans, especially in key House races, upstate, and of course in the Long Island area. But ultimately, I don't see Lee Zeldin winning this race. I think Hochul will, at the end of the day, win it comfortably. But for New York standards, I think it's going to be a relatively somewhat close race. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoy, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.